Hi, I'm Zuber-Skerritt, the producer of this fourth series of video programs on postgraduate supervision. As in the three previous series, the videos are not professionally staged productions, but they have been produced from simple recordings of a residential staff development program held at the Ballina Beach Resort in northern New South Wales in 1996. This year's program focuses on postgraduate supervision of NESB students, short for non-English speaking background students. I hope you will find the following video useful.
First of all, I'd like to proffer Maureen's apologies. She has a small health problem, and also being Dean of a faculty at the end of the academic year is quite time-consuming. However, as Ortrun said, we have worked together for about 17 years, so that I hope in drawing together our joint experiences and learning to produce this paper that I've done justice to her and to my fellow colleagues and students whose work I also present. I also hope that in doing so I won't feel quite as bad as the student whose words I'd like to begin this paper with. The absolute height of panic culminated in a course presentation which required me to give a short explanation of my research project to student colleagues and the course tutors. Asking to be first to present in order to relieve the unbearable stress I was experiencing, I nervously rambled through my presentation, at times actually physically shaking and feeling out of breath. I couldn't help thinking that I was now not only a private failure, but a public one as well. This quotation haunts me. It was written by a student for whom I had some responsibility, not as a supervisor, but as the postgraduate studies director, and the leader of the research methods course in which he was invited to make this presentation. The student at that point, 6 months into his studies for his PhD, was a relatively senior academic coming from a home country some distance from England. What had we done to reduce such a person to this state? Had all our years of developing a research course and a research community which intended to be supportive and person-centered as well as being academically rigorous been in vain? The rest of the text from which this quotation derives suggests that they had not been, but the incident itself, its antecedents and aftermath, which I'll return to later in the paper, were salutary experiences, warning us never to become complacent. We clearly still have much to learn from our students, though we have over 30 successfully completed doctoral supervisions between us for our own departments, a further 10 for whom we acted as consultant supervisors for other departments and other institutions, and many more happily currently making good progress. Nevertheless, experiential learning is only one facet. We also value learning from peers, and so have attended and run several training courses for supervisors. We are reminded of Elton's words, at the level of research supervision, where there is usually a unique student experience, learning from experience can hardly be an adequate preparation. In the paper from which that recommendation or that quotation comes, he does recommend a particular form of staff development program for supervisors, while in a previous one, which he wrote with Maureen Pope, he advocated a collegial relationship between all involved in the research of a department, that is, academic and support staff with postgraduate students. Since we endeavour to implement both of these recommendations, our endorsement of them both as important, in addition to experience, is axiomatic. However, we would go further and say that even the three together are insufficient if alertness to the diversity of our students is lacking. I think I have to agree here with the student panel yesterday who say how important it is to recognise that diversity. Sweeping generalisations about research students are as inappropriate as any other generalisations about a nominal group, be they women, black people, English people, Australians, or whatever. In this paper, we shall refer to work which suggests that students from particular backgrounds may have some particular problems, but we emphasise that these are only guidelines about the dimensions of that diversity. We will suggest that successful supervision, though requiring many skills and a reasonable knowledge of the academic field and research methods, rests on sensitivity to the uniqueness of each student's experience and on professional flexibility, which allows us to respond appropriately to it. So let us first address the context of both the students' and the supervisors' experience, starting first with the UK scene. Only a month ago, in May '96, a consultative document entitled Review of Postgraduate Education, which was produced by a group proposed by the Higher Educational Funding Council for England, the Committee for Vice-Chancellors and Principals, and the Standing Committee of Principals, and chaired by Harris, made strong recommendations about the support and training of postgraduate students. They recommend, among other things, that what may be expected of and by such a student should be clearly spelled out, and that a code of practice be adopted which would require institutions to have in place, and I quote, appropriate facilities and supervisory arrangements. Further, it was their view that such students should only be eligible for government or HEFC grants to study subject areas within institutions which have a pervasive research culture and can deliver excellence in research education. Referring particularly to overseas students, the document recommended a directory modelled on the Australian listing provision, which should include full specification of prices and sources of support for students. It is clear from this reference, and several like it, that cognizance had been taken of the practice of other, sometimes competitive, countries. It seems likely that these recommendations will be adopted by a government alert to potential competition from abroad. So to the international context. Although it is no consolation to British academics, the universality of the problem is evidenced by an increasing number of articles in the academic press, at conferences and in journals dealing with related issues. A recent and continuing polemic in the Times Higher about joint European projects and exchanges with Italian universities, where staff-student ratios suggest that individual student supervision must be negligible, something like 100 to 1, point to a European dimension. A poignant paper written by Mullen and Dalton, two recently graduated PhD students, was given at a Canadian conference, and it reflected on the tension between the promise and myth produced by the inexplicitness of the biases and assumptions in higher education. This paper was received with some empathy and sympathy by other recent participants in the postgraduate experience in North American universities. Asplund and O'Donoghue confirmed the paucity of research reports concerned with enhancing postgraduate study, providing a comprehensive bibliography of most which do, which I commend to you, while suggesting that all is not well, not just in the case of supervision of overseas students, but in the supervision of higher degrees in general in the English-speaking world. In spite of our extensive research training program and departmental efforts on their own to establish interest and support groups, each one of the 70 responding in the research identified a range of difficulties encountered in the course of their studies. Each led a complex life in which some facets were harmonious, while others caused dissonance. To quote from that chapter, we found that there is little evidence in the complete data for attributes which denote an average doctoral student, apart from rather predictable ones such as demonstrating perseverance and courage and having a questioning, challenging approach to life. Although each emphasized a range of personal benefits related to the student role, many noted costs, which included the neglect or loss of previous roles, especially social ones, with consequent feelings of guilt. The pressures of conflicting duties, with consequent anger at the imposition or disappointment in self for not being able to cope. Personal relationships put at risk as partners and friends react to neglect, or indeed to the developmental changes in someone they once thought they knew. I'd like to show you one of the concept maps which demonstrates the experience of one such student. The focal role is the research student, and you can see how other roles enhance, inhibit, restrict, empower the role of the research student. It's interesting to reflect on what her map might have looked like had she undertaken her studies abroad. Although the roles in the ellipse here, mother, homemaker, husband, supporter, and wife, in fact, together totally restrict the research student role, nevertheless, they are clearly a strong and an important part of her self-image and of the life that she led before enrolling at the university. As was noted by the students group yesterday, students like her who study abroad face the problems either of maintaining these roles at a distance or of helping the family adjust to a new context while at the same time taking on a new role themselves. One student for whom we provided some research advice had as one focus the counselling of such students who have domestic or personal problems. She noted that in particular, that in our institutions, counselling is conducted in the Western mode of empowering student self-help. This can be disorientating and countercultural for students used to different modes of support, seeking wisdom from experts, especially when they would, in their own countries, only seek advice from close family and friends. When these networks are distant or experiencing trauma themselves, then the problems are exacerbated. We have had experience of supporting students in both of those stressful situations. For example, a mother who left 4 young children back home in Malaysia, and a father who brought his wife and young children with him from Pakistan. Both succeeded in their studies, but would have had more difficulty in doing so, we would suggest, had the institution not been tolerant of frequent visits home or of campus work being undertaken well within school hours to accommodate school runs, or had it not introduced the students to Muslim support networks and provided a small space for religious observance, and so on. Again, Harris made the point that both social and working environments conducive to postgraduate study should be provided as a matter of course in all institutions undertaking such work. He was, as we are, clearly aware that in many institutions, the social welfare of postgraduate students comes very low in the list of priorities. But rather than providing a list of anecdotes of our own experience, we'll only use these as illustrations as we review in the next section some of the points made in the literature about the additional responsibilities which arise for supervisors when the particular problems of overseas students demand a special duty of care. So to the dilemmas inherent in studying abroad. First, lest we forget the caveat about not jumping too readily to stereotypes about overseas students, let us return to the student given voice at the beginning of this paper. He had arrived in England having given his research proposal a lot of thought. His research questions were clear, and his research design, based on his master's training in research methods, almost complete. Let him provide the essence of his dilemma, having studied with us for 6 months. One consideration that never crossed my mind while developing my ideas in home institution, was the paradigm or worldview with which I was approaching this important task of whatever his research was. What I soon discovered after my arrival in England was that a concept of the, or a single, research paradigm did not exist. I was overwhelmed by the discovery of literally an entire other world of perspectives on the research process. As the new information filtered in, I began to feel my proposals start to unravel little by little. I had doubts about my original ideas, my original proposal, as well as my place in this new system. I felt incredibly vulnerable and naive. From the evocative way in which he described his predicament, it is clear that his command of English is good. So from what exotic context, divorced from contact with these alternative paradigms, did he come? His home base is a prestigious university in the southern states of the USA. As his PhD story is still in progress, I cannot provide you with a happy ending, for though with the support of his supervisor and peer students, he has come to enjoy reconstruing research and its approaches and methods, he still faces the challenge of ensuring the credibility of his own work in his own context. Again, a point that was made yesterday by the research student group. This highlights for us that although supervisors as teachers should be change agents, they must also be sensitive to the point of departure of the student and to the context to which they must return having completed their studies. In the UK and in Australia, there are many of us who work within an interpretative paradigm for our endeavours of human inquiry. In the last quarter century, yes, I'm afraid it's that long, we have striven to alert the research establishment to that paradigm's value and appropriateness, so that rigorous work of that nature has gained a general, if grudging, acceptance. Individuals from the Pacific Rim countries, and indeed from the USA, may, within the comfort and security of our context, choose to embrace similar epistemologies to our own. Further, they may intend to return to their own countries as disciples, promoting the adoption of alternative frameworks within which to view knowledge and its development. However, we do them a disservice if we do not respect their need to produce work which both meets our exacting standards and is politically acceptable in their own national higher education context. One of our students, Rohana Zubir from Malaysia, succeeded in this task by producing a thesis which addressed an educational problem by collecting both qualitative and quantitative data. This was presented alongside an eloquent argument for bridging the paradigms. This illustrates our agreement that supervision needs to be student responsive and open to modification. Though it is important that students are helped to adapt to our respective cultures, it is not enough for us to expect, as Ginsberg in 1992 advocated, that students need to modify the world's view of their native culture and the academic culture in which they were educated if they are to gain acceptance in this new academic context. Modification with understanding is required by both parties if we are not to risk our educational values being perceived as a dangerous threat to the national cultures of others. Two dimensions of our shared academic culture are worthy of being set in relief against the background of Asian, particularly Southeast Asian, educational norms. One is the concept of argument or debate, while the other is the notion of originality. In Western culture, we expect to hone our ideas by subjecting them to challenge. Certainly in the UK, debating societies are a common feature of secondary schooling. We are taught to plan our propositions carefully, to be alert to potentially contradictory views, and to marshal our arguments accordingly. It is interesting to reflect on Lakoff and Johnson's observation that in English the war metaphor pervades our language concerning argument. For instance, we shoot ideas down. While in some Eastern languages, the parallel metaphor is a dance of equals in which the steps are matched. It is Lakoff and Johnson's contention that such predominant metaphors reflect the culture and values from which they emerge, so it comes as no surprise that in many Eastern cultures it is considered inappropriate to query the wisdom of experts, those in authority, that is, the teachers. Further, such cultures may place a high value on compromise as a survival technique. Divergence is thus viewed as a social evil, with unanimity regarded as a social good to be aspired to. As an exemplar, strong religious traditions in Thailand condemning any expression of displeasure or avowal of conflict, so the resultant attitudes can frustrate attempts at intellectual development intended to be achieved by setting opposing views in counterpoint. It has been our experience in working in a variety of Thai universities that energies are devoted to remarking and elaborating the similarities in counterposed examples. Albeit that we may see differences to be of interest and to contain potential for creativity, to emphasize them would be considered very bad manners indeed. As Doug Smith said yesterday, we must acknowledge differences as well as similarities. Innovation, creativity, and originality are key parameters by which we judge the quality of MPhil and PhD theses. Nevertheless, we expect initial contentions to be justified by reference to preceding literature, while new ones require the support of data collected with expertise and integrity. It is surely not surprising that students whose main education has been in societies in which conformity is valued above individuality, in which social replication is the norm, experience a degree of confusion. Indeed, we are frequently asked by even our British-bred students why they need to express things in a novel way when some revered expert had already expressed them both pithily and cogently. Our conventions, too, are derived from tradition, and it is incumbent upon us to make them explicit to others. A case in point is where we draw the boundary on the continuum between authenticity and plagiarism, since for us, acknowledgement of sources is an ethical issue, while for others, it is a latent assumption that all we say is derived in some way from the work of others deemed better than ourselves. Just as we need to challenge the suppositions of others, so too we need to confront the premises to which we are heir. In the realm of teaching those from other cultures, Jones made the following point, which is still salient today. The assumption underlying much practice in adult learning, in higher education at any rate, is that the students are vocal, articulate, and well-read in English. Consequently, when teachers meet college students who are silent and who in addition lack a background in English, they may get the impression that they are instructing inferior students. Of course, reticence does not imply resistance to learning, much less stupidity. Reluctance to speak may be a cultural value, a norm picked up from society. The norm of reticence frequently accompanies that of avoidance of contention, and may also be accompanied by forms of non-verbal communication which we may not always recognize between cultures. This is a huge topic which we can only illustrate briefly here to encourage fellow supervisors to explore in relation to the cultural origins and customs of their own students. On a light note, you may be amused to contemplate the contortions to which we subjected our aging English bones while trying to sit decorously on low stools while avoiding the very insulting behaviour of pointing our feet at Thai colleagues. The inelegant way in which we tried to incorporate a Western handshake while not giving or receiving gifts with the very dirty, unclean left hand. The deliberate suppression of feelings of panic and consequent flinching when our Middle Eastern students invade the rather large personal space which we British people find it comfortable to inhabit. Even though we, as psychologists, are aware that in some cultures an averted gaze is a mark of respect, nevertheless, our own culturally ordained need to look in the eyes of those with whom we are in conversation has led to many a cricked neck when we have been working with, for instance, our Malaysian students. On a more serious note, this reminds us, though, that we may intend to make the students' interpersonal transactions more comfortable and fruitful during their stay with us by alerting them to our habits, for instance, that of eye contact. It would be unfortunate, though, if they took those habits home with them, thereby earning for our respective education systems the reputation that they produce arrogant and ill-mannered academics. In relation to behavioural disparity, Jones also raised the issue of an incomplete command of English, again, as was noted yesterday, a very complex topic. Perhaps this is the most prolific source of potential disaster in our work with overseas students, and thus a fitting specific focus for this programme. Students with non-English speaking backgrounds must cope with deriving understanding from both our spoken and written words, and must reciprocate by demonstrating that understanding in oral and written forms themselves. This is a difficult enough task at degree level without combining it with the intellectual rigour and original research required of higher degree students. The order of magnitude of the problem with which NESB students must wrestle is difficult to contemplate for those of us for whom English is our main language. If it were only differences in spelling and grammar, information technology with spelling and grammar checks, and common sense would come to our rescue. However, in addition, there are complications, such as the nuances of meaning of words which appear to be synonymous. One example that statisticians might use is the important and significant difference between important and significant difference. The social, cultural, and literary reference of our metaphors cause some problems. For instance, the eponymous catch-22 situation, and the subtle shifts in language register which denote a move from informal to formal communication, to name but a few. These are compounded by the use of professional jargon, not to mention the complication of dialect and accent. I was being encouraged at coffee break this morning to do this paper in my native Scottish, so perhaps I'll do the rest like that. As if that was not enough, the recent research on the link between... Now you know what it's like. As if that were not enough, recent research by Cincotta and Underwood on the link between working memory span and native language indicates that the structure of some languages, such as Arabic, limits the amount of information which can typically be held in working memory. This results in both slower reading speeds and limits on comprehension of strings of spoken words, no matter in which language the person is subsequently working. To illustrate some of the language barriers that supervisors might face when working with NESB students, we will focus on one potential source of students, Papua New Guinea, drawing on the work of two authors. McLaughlin, writing about improving the quality of education in PNG as a developing country, and Spear, one of our own research students resident and working in PNG, who investigated the development of preparation courses for overseas studies for Indigenous academic staff, most of whom were Australia-bound. Both remarked that in many instances, levels of spoken, colloquial Australian English were deceptively good. Deceptively because it disguised poor comprehension of academic lectures, limited reading ability, and very limited formal writing skills. They noted the predominance of ritual in learning, just as ritual predominates in other aspects of traditional society. They describe ritual as the essence of ritual as being on the correct utterance of a spell or secret name. Spear suggested that many of those who do well in PNG secondary and tertiary education do so because they have conformed to the rote learning process demanded by their home society and are thus unprepared for individual study initiatives and for critical thinking. McLaughlin provided a vivid illustration which I've been dying to show you. A gibbob is a zingut and it's used for willeting things together. Alfred, what is a gibbob? Alfred, sir, a gibbob is a zingut and it's used for willeting things together. Teacher, excellent answer. I just love this willeting idea. He used this as an example of a survival tactic rather than a learning strategy, used when individuals are unwilling to admit to or demonstrate a lack of understanding. And he suggested as a caveat that this tactic's contemporary success in school and its cultural appropriateness based on respect for authority will encourage its survival in higher education. The survival of his colleagues when they do study abroad is more the focus of Spear's concern, as he elicited from those who returned their most outstanding challenges. Whether or not they achieved success in their studies, most cited isolation from their spouses as being the most traumatic. This was as much from the perspective of guilt about those remaining in PNG being considered to have been left vulnerable to gossip and even sorcery threats, as from loneliness experienced by the students themselves. In his program, devised to prepare appropriately his colleagues for study abroad, there is a consideration for preparing the family as well as the prospective student for the new life. Although it would be ideal if his suggestions were implemented by the country or institution of origin of all such students, some of the information which he discovered to be invaluable could be supplied by the host institutions as a matter of form. Although when we read the list, most seem obvious, we must admit that they far exceed what we typically supply to our students. The relative costs of living, important for those on a fixed income, especially those coming to the UK where even academics find it difficult to make ends meet. A city plan with special aspects noted, such as suburbs to avoid. Can I just quickly tell you that we were once invited to a southern Australian city to do some staff development work, and we asked to be accommodated in a reasonably priced hotel, being English, very near the university. It was only after a fire alarm bell had us out in the street in our little white nighties that we discovered that this was the red light district of Adelaide. Special habits and customs so that inadvertent transgression may be avoided. The position of women in the respective culture, as Christine alluded to yesterday, and how to deal with racial problems. Spear illustrated the importance of helping students to find adequate accommodation by reflecting back to his own distant experience as a student, when African colleagues spent the whole winter in bed, not conducive to academic study, because they had failed to check properly the heating provisions, something he assured us that German students would do first thing. There are many other dimensions of threat to the successful completion of study of our students from the Pacific Rim, which we could dwell on. The economic family sacrifice to enable the studies of many students from Southeast Asia, which can be an intolerable burden to them. The fear of being wrong, thereby losing face, which some Japanese students experience, are but two examples. It would not be surprising if supervisors in Australia didn't ask the same questions as those which arose in similar workshops with UK colleagues. What can we do, given our limited resources, and where do our responsibilities end? If resources were unlimited, including our own time, energy, and patience, the problems we've been discussing would be less critical. But academic roles and duties are now complex and demanding. Dedicated people must daily choose to do some things less well than they would wish, and to omit doing some things altogether. Other experts, like Susan Addison from yesterday, need to be called upon, who can provide courses and guidance on English language, or counsellors for personal problems, though we noted earlier that the latter may require additional training. As Harris in the consultative document mentioned earlier highlighted, the full cost of this additional support should be overtly noted in the fee structure, for institutions have budgets to meet and support systems cannot be stretched indefinitely to cope. He also suggested that particular regard be paid to student feedback. Home students, particularly and certainly those back in the UK, will become disaffected and vocal if their resources, including supervision time, are reduced to meet the needs of overseas students. They may also question the justice of being required to write elegantly themselves while others have support for their writing. And it is to us as their supervisors in the first instance that they will address these apparent injustices, so we need to feel comfortable with the answers we provide. Supervisors have a duty to society as well as to their students to ensure that standards are maintained and that funds are expended on useful, original research, and that all students, whatever their origin, develop new expertise and learning styles appropriate for continued lifelong learning in ever-changing contexts. In order to do this, we too need support so that staff development workshops should cease to be deemed luxuries and should be provided as necessities, especially as student numbers and diversity increase. We also need the support of institutional policies and procedures, as Nick Knight pointed out yesterday. And so to the main conclusions. 3 particular points seem worth distilling from the foregoing discussion. First, just as it is a misassumption that academic staff can supervise by instinct, so it is wrong to assume that students have an inbuilt potential to respond appropriately to any individual form of supervision. It is only just and productive that we make our respective roles and necessarily limited responsibilities clear. Second, although there are some good arguments and strong advocates of the cultural melting pot notion, it may be more appropriate to value diversity and help NESB students to preserve some of their cultural differences, especially when they have to return home when their studies are complete. Finally, I'd like to translate into the context of our trying to attract higher degree students from overseas the advice given by Little to potential consultants in the 80s, selling their educational advice to developing countries. Only when prepared to spend time doing our homework to learn and understand more about the situation on which advice is sought, and only when prepared to share responsibility when things go badly wrong, should we erect our for sale sign. Each student brings with them a unique combination of needs, desires and expectations, of skills, abilities, embryonic, partially developed or well-honed, not to mention experience and style. Each case has political, economic and legal connotations and ramifications. Supervisors respond to this complexity in their own unique ways, often supported by inadequate organisational structures and vague guidance on modus operandi. As the diversity in maturity and cultural background of our postgrad students increases, so will the stretching of our ingenuity. So will our need for peer support grow. Our needs often parallel theirs, and they are not all insensitive to the demands they make on us as supervisors. Let me read the final words of this paper to a student. She had written fluently of her perceptions of the supervisory role for our Supervisor's Handbook, and concluded thus: the personal characteristics and talents required for all the aspects mentioned in this article call for a super being. Being human, most of us can only do some of the things some of the time. For most research students, the most they can expect from a supervisor is the ability to apply the right pressure at the right moment in order to keep their momentum rolling towards completion. For my part, I want a supervisor to be a kind, considerate friend, whilst at the same time operating as a devil's advocate. This is probably asking the impossible of any human relationship, but I ask it nonetheless.